Good afternoon. Please excuse the cane and the having to sit to speak to you. I'm in the process of recovering from the second of two major spinal surgeries, which totaled 11 and a half hours in the surgery. So it's working, but it ain't working like it used to work. And funnily enough, I've been doing this for 50 years, and this is the first time I've sat in front of an audience feeling nervous. I'm not nervous about you folks, I'm not nervous about what I'm going to talk about, but I'm sure as hell nervous about falling off this freaking stool. Because if I do, I'm yet to learn how to get off the floor elegantly. And it would take the rest of the session to do it, by the way. So my role is to talk to you about a major model that we developed over some years with a number of academics. So I'm just going to, we've got that one up, good. This is a very simple model that we developed about 25 years ago, and it aims to capture what we call the leadership culture performance connection. The notion that leadership drives culture and culture drives leadership. It's a symbiotic relationship. So the culture you have at the moment is a consequence of the leadership that you've had for about the last 20 years, and the leadership you have right now is a consequence of the culture that you've had for about the last 20 years. If you want a very simple illustration of that enculturation process, I'll give you a quick story. I went to secondary school, I went to a very traditional Catholic boys' boarding school, which was grounded on the English public school system. And I'll give you that background because we had, as part of the culture of that school, a particular process that was referred to as fagging. And fagging was a final year boy was allocated a first year boy who was essentially a slave for that final year boy. So it was your job to make that guy's coffee, to make sure his rugby gear was clean, etc., and all the rest of it. And we had a new young priest who was just starting off as a teacher, and when I first started in the third form, and he was somewhat visionary, so he ran a workshop towards the end of the first year with the kids in the class to answer the question, what would you want the school to do when you're the lead boys in 4 years' time? Let me tell you, we all said to a kid, no fagging. Fagging sucks, there's no fun associated with it whatsoever. We all thought it would be a good idea to get rid of it. But the point of the story is by the time we got to the upper sixth form, the final year of school, fagging suddenly looked like a really good idea. And what's more, we had earned it because we had been there and done that. And so this is how enculturation works. So hang on to that notion that both leadership and culture have that relationship that goes on, circular causality, time and time again. Now what we get as consultants and creators of these tools and the survey tools that you've heard talked about this morning is we get organisations come to us and say, you know, we really enjoyed NZ Super's presentation or whoever it might be, Contact, etc. Can we talk to the folks there about what they did? We'd say, we'll set up a meeting for you. And some of these clients of ours who have managed to attain constructive cultures, on the other hand, it's actually indicative of a constructive culture anyway, have been very helpful in giving time to talk to other organisations about what they might look to do. So we get these literally thousands of requests in Australia and New Zealand, can we talk to, etc. And we'd set that up. We began to get interested in trying to organise some of that. So in 2006, which now sounds like a very long time ago, but let me tell you, the older you get, the shorter that time span seems to feel. In 2006, we got some academics to work on a qualitative process of looking at what 5 organisations, they were based in or are based in Australia, had done with their culture and the impacts that it had had on that. And so that is published in a book called In Great Company. We published it, sold it in 2006, a business bestseller in the region, etc., and all that sort of stuff. And it's basically looking at 5 organisations and what they did to change their culture, what worked, what didn't work, etc. So we sold out of those, and in 2011, post the global financial crisis, we decided to go back to those organisations and revisit them to say, what did you do during the crisis? So as one of the presentations talked about, I think it might have been Mika from NZ Super, is what happens when things get really tough. And so, and particularly in Australia, they experience the GFC in a different way than we did. And so we tracked through the newer version of the book, published in 2011, on what these organisations did in these tough times. So that is available. There are some copies I noticed out at the desk, out in the foyer there where lunch is served. If you want to talk to somebody about that, please feel free. We also dug into it a little deeper and started to get interested because a second phenomenon happened. And that was many of these organisations who had gone off to see one of these companies about what they did came to us and said, look, we did that and it didn't work. It didn't seem to be particularly helpful. So we began to think about why that might be. And we developed the idea of organisational consciousness. So I've watched you from initially down the very back and across the side here, taking photographs of various interesting slides that have come up. Some of you have written like crazy, well done. It doesn't mean to say it's going to work for you. We began to get interested in why do certain things work with certain types of organisations. And we developed this idea of organisational consciousness. That organisations, through the leadership that they have a collective unconscious, leadership consciousness. And by putting in a very high level strategy to a low level consciousness organisation probably won't work. So when you go to some of these extraordinary organisations that achieve quantifiable, significant culture change, rather than looking at what they're doing now, depending of course on where your organisation is on that scale, you might be better off talking to them what they did 5 or 6 years ago, because that's where you're at in terms of their particular journey, etc. So before I leave this particular slide and get into building that model for you and giving you a little bit of information around that, it is explored in the book that I mentioned in Great Company, and there are also 2 white papers, Stages of Organisational Consciousness, Part 1, Part 2, on our website under Conference Resources for you to download and have a look at. Suggest you do that. It's very valuable information. Before I leave this slide, I just want to make one point. Don't hesitate to understand, I'm not asking you to believe, don't hesitate to understand that both leadership and organisation drive organisational performance. Both leadership and organisational culture, I didn't say that word culture, both leadership and organisational culture drive organisational performance. We've known since 1955 that there is a direct causational relationship between effective leadership, depending upon how you define it and measure it, and organisational performance. So that's a long time ago, it's long before most of you were born. We've known since 1985 that there is a concept called organisational culture out there, and we've been able to quantify and measure that by measuring the behavioural norms that exist in the organisation since 1987. So this stuff is not new. It's conceptually and research-wise been around for a long time. So have the confidence on the basis of what you've heard this morning that if your organisation is low on the consciousness model stages, that it is possible, it is achievable, and it's very real. So it's not about just having a great place to work or a nice place to work or everybody's very friendly. That's way too simple. If life were that easy, we wouldn't be sitting here today. It's about creating an organisation that is pursuing excellence in everything that it does, including excellence in its people management. So let me introduce this model to you. So the idea of the limited amount of information that I'll give you on each of these 6 stages is where might you be in the organisation. So to context what we did with this, we took data from 2,000 odd organisations, the N equals up there, something just a little over 2,000, Australian and New Zealand organisations that had data over a period of time like you've just heard this morning. And we looked at certain criteria to define consciousness levels. We looked at certain styles on the circumplex so that we could come up with an aggregated circumplex for each of those stages and what it takes eventually to move from stage 1 to stage 2, etc. on. So just to work through those very carefully, I put the percentages in there based on that data analysis, mainly to make the point that most organisations are below that midpoint line. So culture is not something that's well understood out there. That's your role in life to help people to understand that. It's our role in life to help you get on top of all that stuff. It's not particularly well understood, so the vast majority of organisations have what we would call a relatively low level of consciousness and in all probability a defensive circumplex. So the first stage is called the denial stage. So for want of a metaphor, the hear no evil, see no evil. So at this level there is no awareness of the role of culture at all. It's seen as somewhat wishy-washy kind of stuff. Okay? Second stage is the non-responsive stage. So at this stage there's some awareness of culture, but it's not seen as being particularly important. Third stage is the compliance stage. This is where culture is now beginning to create some awareness throughout the organisation of the role of culture, but it's an HR issue, which of course we all know it isn't. It's about the entirety of the organisation, but it's seen as something that's driven by HR. So it's your problem to solve our problem kind of mentality. But at least you're tracking up there, and if you look at the data that's in the white paper and in the book, you're beginning to see some constructive styles dominating. So it's worth aiming for. Then we get to the next stage, which is the efficiency stage. And at this particular point, there is considerably more awareness of the role of culture. There's an understanding that things need to change, that we need to adapt to stay relevant, etc., given the theme we're working with. But it's seen as an incremental effort rather than a transformational effort. Eventually we get to that point. The strategic proactivity is the second to last stage, where it's now seen as something that's vital to the business, it's integrated throughout the organisation, and even more so at the sustaining resilience stage, where it's about our role in society and how we can help that. So the object of the exercise, if you're looking at the white papers or reading the book, is where on those 6 stages does your organisation sit, and so therefore what are the challenges you face as part of that, and what do you need to do about it? The next thing we did to that was, it's like all models, it's nice and neat. So it begins as a theoretical model, then we want to turn it into an empirical model. So we began to now look at the notion of causal factors. You've seen some graphs, you've heard people talk about the causal factors and the outcomes, what's driving culture, what's the outcomes of culture, etc. That in looking at culture change without a great deal of education, we tend to focus too much on the outcomes. You can't change an outcome, you can only change a cause. So if we refocus our efforts on those, what we happen to call causal factors, then you're more likely to get better bang for your buck out of that. So we looked at the shifts that occurred over time through those stages, through organisations that had managed to move from the denial to the non-responsive to the etc, etc, etc. And the first thing we learned, and I was very interested with your comment about 1 step forward and 5 steps back, Jan, this is really what it's saying. So you learn it the hard way through experience, which is the best learning of all, of course. Is it's not linear, it's not neat and tidy like that. There's a big step for the denial to the non-responsive stage. There's an even bigger step from the non-responsive stage to the compliance stage. And then there's a little step to the next, another big step, and then a little step to the final one. And you never stop it, of course. I use the word final. You've heard the word journey time and time again from our brilliant speakers this morning. This is a notion of how that journey operates. So having partially grown up on a farm, I've always used the analogy, it's a bit like when you're in your gumboots and you're stuck in the mud. And you sort of pull it out, you get a step, and then you're stuck again, and then you pull it out, you get a step, and then suddenly you get some momentum and you start to walk. It's like me getting out of bed. Did you know there's actually a right and a wrong way to get out of bed and into bed? So after the first surgery on my back, I had to learn how to get into bed because I couldn't just jump into bed. And so it's like, that's the first step. Once I get in and out of bed, I can now start to walk around the bed. I can now start to go to the bathroom on my own. I can now start to walk down the hallway. So these 1 step at a time kinds of things. So it's not linear. There's some little steps, there's some big steps, and some of those biggest steps are right at the very beginning, which is why so many organisations find it very difficult to change their culture, because they give up because it's too hard at the beginning. If we can persevere and continue with those strategies throughout those stages, the results will speak for themselves. So one of the things as part of a journey we then decided was, rather than aim for the moon, is aim for what's immediately ahead of you in terms of this model. If you're down in the denial, non-responsive, then aim for the compliance. Aim for the efficiency if you're down at that level. Aim for the strategic proactivity if you're at that sort of level. And so that makes it a more manageable concept in terms of culture change reality. The next step in the data analysis, and this took me about a year, was to look at, so what had those organisations actually done in that 2,000 organisation data set to shift from that first stage to that second stage. So I'm going to share some of the insights from that data, and this is written up in the Stages of Consciousness Part 2 white paper that's on the website for you. I need to reiterate here that this is not a notion of one size fits all. So when I say articulation of mission or organisational purpose, it doesn't mean to say that you all do exactly that. You do it in your own way. And what you've heard in several of the speakers, at least I heard in several of the speakers this morning, was that they're doing the same thing, but they're doing it quite differently. And that's the key. There is no one size fits all. Anybody, if you look at a website that says the 5 magic ways to change your culture, I suggest you look at the next step in Google rather than that one. Because again, if it were 5 easy steps, we wouldn't be sitting here, would we? It's not that straightforward. So this is what we found when we looked at what did those organisations in those initial stages of development do to create that culture change that did not magically look suddenly extraordinarily blue, but had a little bit less green and red and a little bit more blue, a little bit more of the constructive, a little less of the passive defensive and aggressive defensive stuff going on. And now putting them in a position where they can now start to build that constructive and continue to reduce that defensive style. So the first was they seemed to work on some aspect of what we would call articulation of mission. So they developed a clear vision, a clear sense of purpose, giving people some sort of meaning associated to what they do. I'm not used to talking with notes, so I keep forgetting to look at them and I keep thinking now, did I talk about that or not? Influence and employee involvement. You've seen some great photographs in the presentations around people sitting around tables with cards and things and meetings, discussions going on, problem solvings, etc. There is nothing more powerful for me and you in terms of our relationship, for me to let you believe that your effort can make a difference, and for you to believe that I'm interested in what you think, that I want to listen to what you think we should be doing differently. So this notion of employee involvement, as it's called in the technical term, is absolutely critical in those early phases of cultural change. Getting people involved, getting them contributing to ideas for improvement, and then acting on those. You've heard about leadership. You've heard a lot about leadership this morning. So leadership underpins all of this. So you begin and end with leadership development, but of course you never end. The notion of autonomy under the heading of job design. Autonomy is I get to control how I do my job. I get to influence the process I use to do my job. Technology is wonderful stuff. I mean, computers have radicalised the world and will continue to do so, but they've dumbed down a lot of jobs. So where people 50 years ago had to think about a process because the process was not working properly, now they just make a screen command. And I'm not anti-technology. I mean, I run the IT technology for the global business for Human Synergistics. But what it has done is reduced autonomy in many jobs out there where people no longer need to think about the work they do. So how can we improve that autonomy and give people more opportunities to contribute and think? And you can see the rest of it. You heard about goal setting from at least 2 of the speakers this morning. And the theme there is building shared understanding, shared meaning, and building a context for improvement. So moving up the stages. So if you're now moving through those first 2 or 3 into the 3rd, 4th and stages, where did those organisations focus? So having done all that previous stuff to some extent, they now move into the HR systems around, you'd heard around transparency, performance appraisal, reinforcement systems. You heard about that in at least 2 of the speakers this morning that I can recall. The goal setting I saw in at least 2 of the presentations. The notion of leaders role modelling, communication stuff. And it was really interesting, it was Jan, I think, talked about one of the issues that she encountered when she came in was that contact energy was a number of silos. So this is the notion of systems from a human resources point of view, is if the organisation is siloed and I'm responsible for organisation A and you're responsible for organisation B, and I have no influence on what organisation B does, why should I give a shit about how they're performing? And yet we say she should be responsible for what Shaun's division is doing. If it's not reinforced and measured and part of that HR system, it does not reinforce and drive the behaviour that you need to be able to do that stuff. Right. Coming through up to the next stage is now basically continue everything you've been doing before, build a case for culture as an organisational accountability, if you like. Again, I don't need to read through the bullet points there for you. So I thought I'd come back and end this where I started. Do not hesitate to understand that both leadership and culture are seriously intertwined. that for you embarking on an organisational change program, adaptation program, improvement program, whatever phrase you want to use around it, try to understand the thinking of your leadership people in terms of their understanding or lack of around organisational culture. Understand that if you think you might be at around the say around the compliant level on that 6-stage model, don't immediately jump into trying to be a strategic proactivity or a sustaining resilience organisation. Strive for the efficiency phase and do what we know will help you move from one to the other and see that it works, and then you can start to build on that. It is a process of building, which is why you've seen, particularly with the likes of Mika at NZ Super, you've been measuring culture for a very long period of time. A number of remeasures. Some of them are fantastically exciting, some of them are slightly more disappointing. That's the way it goes. So keep in mind that your leadership exists because of its culture, your culture exists because of its leadership, and they both combine to impact on the organisation's performance. So that's one of the reasons that we have these awards. This is not easy to do. So we like to celebrate the achievement of organisations and getting right up there towards the top end of that model with these awards that Darren's going to talk about in the middle. So thank you very much. I'm very pleased that I did not fall off the stool.